Jay, help me understand sort of how Paul Manafort finds himself at this point. Katie talking about sort of what will be expected of him here over these coming months. This is a guy who is living lavishly as part of this arrangement. He's having to get rid of some property. He's going to trade his house in East Hampton for the poorhouse, I gather. I mean, he's giving up a lot of assets here, isn't he, Jay?
Well, David, yes, and in fact, just this one sort of deal almost pretty much pays for the entire Mueller investigation. So the president's constant criticism that the Mueller investigation is too expensive, it's a waste of taxpayer money, well, they've recouped a lot of that from Paul Manafort in this deal. So it's millions of dollars, it's a ton of assets, and it really means a huge lifestyle change for this man who once bought, $15,000 jackets and never thought twice about it. He's now going to really have to change his lifestyle considerably, and it also obviously does a huge dent to his business, and that was obviously a big concern with Michael Cohen as well, is that neither of them really could function during this investigation in their respective businesses because the Mueller investigation just sort of took over everything and nobody wanted to pick them up as clients. I think this really is sort of a reputation ruiner for a lot of these guys. What are they going to do after this? Even if they don't serve prison time, which is still a question, what happens after, I think, is a real concern for their families as well as they themselves.
Katie Fang, this is kind of like a William Faulkner short story where you have an event that took place and you're getting an understanding of what took place in that room from a variety of different narrators. You have Paul Manafort, who was present for that meeting in Trump Tower. We know now that others are going to testify about what they saw transpire during that meeting as well. I'm curious just sort of what your sense is of the import of that meeting. Paul Manafort, we know now, is connected to so many other personages in Eastern Europe that could be of interest to this investigation. How interested are you? How interested do you think Robert Mueller is at this point in that meeting still?
Oh, absolutely. Remember, Robert Mueller is looking at obstruction. Not only is there conspiracy with the Trump campaign, with the Russians to influence the outcome of that presidential election, but was there obstruction of justice that happened after the fact? We know that there was a false statement released by Trump from Air Force One concerning the nature of that meeting at the Trump Tower in June of 2016. We were told that it had to do with Russian adoption. Later on, we found out there was an email chain implicating Trump Jr., and it clearly said that they had dirt on Hillary Clinton. That's exactly what that meeting was supposed to be about. Paul Manafort, we should call him the Russian whisperer. He has exceptional ties and knowledge when it comes to the Ukraine and Russia, and he's the guy who's going to be able to tell Mueller exactly why that meeting happened, because we also have heard a few weeks ago that there might have been a pre-meeting to that meeting that Paul Manafort attended, and if that makes sense, then Paul Manafort told Donald Trump, because Manafort was the campaign chairman, that that meeting was going to happen, and that means Trump knew exactly what the Russians were bringing to the table at Trump Tower.
Jay, what does this mean for the president and for his legal team? There was a short statement from Rudy Giuliani that came out after this happened yesterday. It was a statement that was revised subsequently. A clause was taken out of it by Rudy Giuliani, that being that Paul Manafort is going to tell the truth. What do you make of how the White House is approaching this, how the president is approaching this? I read from that tweet there at the top, the president again bringing up some familiar tropes when it comes to this investigation. How do you suspect he and Rudy Giuliani and the lot are going to react to this as the new week begins?
Well, David, I think it's looking very lonely for the president these days. So many of those people whom he thought would protect him have abandoned him. Just a year ago, Michael Cohen was saying he would lay down his life for Donald Trump, and then, a year later, he's flipping on him. Same for Manafort. Just a month ago, the president was tweeting how Manafort was so loyal, saying how great he was, and now Manafort's also abandoned the president. And so I think the legal team, you see the president sort of tweeting vaguely about what's going on here, but he's not naming Manafort strikingly, and he's not really tweeting in this sort of like those tweet storms that you were used to in a lot of these circumstances. And so how subdued he is, I think, is an example of how seriously they must be taking this and how worried they might be, because the next people, again, in line here are, frankly, Donald Trump Jr., who was at that infamous meeting in Trump Tower, and what happens when, if it's the president has to decide, is it my son who I throw under the bus next with everybody else who I have already thrown under the bus, or do I save myself and just and let him take the fall for this, or whatever this is? And so I think it must be really concerning, knowing that as they flip increasingly closer towards the president, he must be feeling very, very worried for his family and for his presidency.
Katie, we got to talk about this pardon dangle and some of the points that Jay was raising there. A lot of people suspected that might be in the cards for Paul Manafort. You remember after that first trial in the Eastern District District of Virginia. You had the president in that interview on Fox News praising Paul Manafort for standing up, for not being a flipper. Again, the president professing to be somebody who knows flippers and has known them for 30 or 40 years. Why do you think this didn't materialize? A lot of reporting here on the quality of the conversations that were taking place between Paul Manafort's counsel and President Trump's counsel as well.
You really have to read tea leaves when it comes to whether or not a pardon was being intimated, if not totally offered, maybe behind back channels to Paul Manafort. Here, what you don't hear from Donald Trump is praise for Paul Manafort, but you also don't hear derision or condemnation of Paul Manafort, even after the man pled guilty to that multi-page superseding criminal information that laid out in explicit, painful detail exactly how un-American Paul Manafort is and was when he was trying to work for the Ukraine. And so what I think could happen is Trump could still pardon Paul Manafort, but Paul Manafort, again, if he's already given the goods to Bob Mueller, then really you can pardon him, but he may have exposure to state charges and multi-jurisdictions, and that would not save Paul Manafort if Trump tries to pardon him.
Jay Newton-Small, how much attention are you paying to what's going on in New York City? Michael Cohen, of course, based up here. He pleaded in district court, and there are reports now in Vanity Fair that he is considering talking to special counsel Robert Mueller as that investigation continues. How important a key is that to this investigation, do you think?
Well, certainly, I mean, Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's one of his closest confidants for many, many years. I mean, we don't know what Michael Cohen knows. Certainly, the case against Michael Cohen was sort of spun off by Bob Mueller, and he had a separate plea himself, having to deal with the sort of Stormy Daniels and the covert payments to her and another woman ahead of the election. But the question really is, if he is talking to Bob Mueller, what does he know? What did the president trust him with? What did the president talk to him about? Was the president ever worried about legal jeopardy in issues relating to this, and what were his thinking behind it, if that's the case? And so, and it certainly seems that Michael Cohen is not a friend of the president these days, and he seems willing to give up the goods on the president because he's so, you know, he feels that he's been not only thrown under the bus, but he's the one feeling the pain. He and his family are suffering, his business is suffering, and the president, whom at his, you know, directed him to make these payments, directed him to do these things, didn't help him out, didn't really help pay his legal fees, eventually abandoned him. And so Michael Cohen sees no reason to be faithful, loyal anymore, and so he's potentially could be vindictive here and go after the president and tell Bob Mueller everything, and whatever it is that he knows.
Jay Newton-Small, contributor to Time Magazine, thank you very much for your time. Katie, thanks. Stick around if you would. We'll come back to you a little bit later in the show. I thank both of you for your time today.